Okay, can you see that okay, Jose?
Yes, that's great, thanks, lovely. So this week's session, or today's session, is looking at learning specifically and how to run a session to really maximize the learning that people get from the input that you're giving them. We're really aware that there's so much information that people need.
The problem we've got,
and we've been working quite closely with Kalyani and Dean and with people from the Home Office to really sort of evaluate what information it is that people most need, and there's a lot of it. So the slides that you've got through as part of the welcome workshop are, there's a lot in there, and making sure that people leave the room clear and remembering the things they need to remember is particularly important, because some of this can make a real difference to people's lives going forward, or most of it will. So Alex, if you could move us on. So today we're going to be, first of all, hearing from Shahrazad about what it's like to go to school in Afghanistan, so that we've got a sense of what people might be expecting from a learning situation when they walk in the room, which may be quite different to what they're meeting, depending on how you're running the session. We'll explore a bit about the difference between coaching and mentoring, I'll outline that, and then look at the different potential roles of a workshop leader, and specifically which roles are going to be most appropriate and useful in this situation with this particular task. We'd like to outline the framework that we're using around psychological well-being and role development, and this is very much a philosophy and understanding of what sits underneath the work that we do and how we are when we're in the room with people. I hope it's helpful. You can feed back to us once we've shared that with you. We'll be very practically looking at how to lay out a room and do groupings and the pros and cons of different layouts, so that you've got that awareness when you're deciding how you want to manage the space. There's a few practical pointers about helping people engage and learn, which is very much drawn from a teaching and learning background. I'll admit up front, Alex and I both have a teaching background, teacher training. So some of this we're moving in because we think these are very transferable skills from a teaching situation to a workshop and presenting situation. And finally, we'll look a bit about how you check understanding, and then we'll close down. So that's our running order. So I'm going to hand over to Shahrazad now. He's just going to tell us a bit about school in Afghanistan. Thanks, Shahrazad.
Thank you. The schooling in Afghanistan is obviously very different from the Western, schooling system. When it comes to UK or US, the schools are here very much student-centric as compared to Afghanistan, where it's not so much about the student and it's more about the teacher just coming into the classes. Usually, I know for many high schools, there are classes, particularly for every subject that students just go to when they have to study it. But in Afghanistan, there's only one class with the structure that you're seeing, which after sixth grade, it's actually segregated between females and males. So they don't, after sixth grade, girls and boys don't study together. It's different in some universities. Before the Taliban, they used to study together, but again, there was not like free mixing. It was males in one row and females in one row. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect, I feel the biggest aspect is that the fact that in here, students are taught basically critical thinking, which is, as compared to Afghanistan, people rarely actually do group works or project works where somebody like the teacher appoints a few people to work on something together, which would teach them teamwork or finding stuff or researching or looking for stuff online. We also know that it's very rare for students to have, now it's different, but back in a few years back, it was very hard for them to get the internet or use it or surf to be able to find stuff for their group projects. So I feel like that's a very different. So for people who are already here, they would find this method of answering and asking questions and discussing stuff very different. But I've also noticed that from my experience of being here with many Afghans in one of the theory classes that I'm taking, I've experienced that if you allow them to have all discussion based and answering question based basically meetings, they sometimes overstep. So I feel like it's very important for everybody to know what to like basically expect, what the system is going to look like and how is it different than that of Afghanistan. Because sometimes they just all speak at the same time, or somebody just jumps in before somebody else finishes. So to explain all that differences between this system and the system that they had back home is also very important. But I feel like one of the biggest weaknesses we have is that we don't teach the students critical thinking. Instead, we just, the teachers just tell the students what to study and what to do the homework for tomorrow, and then they have to memorize the same subject or the same material that they're given, and they will be examined on that. So which is very different from the education system here. And I feel like that's the one thing that we need to focus more on when we're dealing with students. And for a lot of people who have graduated a long time ago, I know things have changed now, especially with technology and internet, but that was the case for a lot of people when they graduated like 5-6 years ago. I think you're mute, Joss.
It's always the way. Unmute yourself. So thank you. That was so helpful. What I'm going to do is, with your permission, I'm just going to open some breakout rooms and pop you into them so that you can just talk to one other person and see if you can think of a question to ask, because my experience is that it's the questions which often open out the learning and get us to think a little bit more about things. And having Sherazad here feels like a really good opportunity to me. So you'll only be in there for like 1-2 minutes maximum. It isn't going to be very long, but if you can just check in with one other person and work out one question that you can ask her, that would be really helpful. So I'm going to put people fairly randomly in together. It's also a nice chance to get to meet other people. Okay, so we'll get you back here in a couple of minutes with your question ready to go, or more than one if you wish. Thanks. Aha, there we are. I didn't put us in a breakout room for a question. I could have done. You might have a question for Sherazad.
I was thinking, are we going to go into the breakout rooms as well?
Yeah. Well, you could have. I could, if you want to. I could stick you in there, but I thought it might be quite nice just to say hello and connect as a little group while they're doing that. I did that because my experience on these is that with people's cameras off, if you ask for questions, usually they don't say anything, but the questions are the bit where it kind of can open out a bit. So this is an experiment to see if that flushes questions out the system or not. And we'll get them back in. Nice to see you guys.
Nice to see you too. Hope you're all having a good day so far.
Okay, so questions? Anybody got a question for Sherazad? Let's just go in with it. Lise, did you have a question for her?
No, I've got to apologise because I had to take a call while you were talking, so I wasn't really clear what the question of education.
Okay, so I'm just going to recap that question, which is about the school day, what that looks like, and age of people that people are usually in education, and also how long a term is. So
Yeah.
if we could hand over to you, Sherazad, to...
Yes, so the school year basically starts at March and it ends before the winter, which is different, like 3 months of winter up until December, it's off for everyone because we don't have enough facilities to be able to, provide that for students. A school day typically looks for first graders until like third graders. It's from very early in the morning, let's say 7 up until 12. And then after that, like 12 to 4, it's going to be for higher level students. But it also depends on where in the country you are and what basically school you go to. Because in some private schools, the system is you go at 8 a.m. until 4 p.m. So it's different from that aspect. From first grade until third grade, there's one teacher for all the students and all the subjects. Until fourth, we don't have any science subjects, just math. And then from fourth to sixth grade, where all girls and boys are studying in a mixed classroom, teachers are different for each subject. And then in high school, we have different schools for boys and different schools for girls. They have science subjects and other subjects like math and sometimes language. We have 2 official languages, Pashto and Dari, part of those subjects. And then it also depends, again, the timing depends on the timetable they create, the subjects they create. and the school they go to, basically.
Thank you. It's really useful.
A moment, I'll just get it on the recording.
This meeting is being recorded.
What are the age groups for the grades?
Yes, so it usually starts from 5 to 6 years old. We have pre-garden too, but then, I mean, preschool, which is called kindergarten, which is very rare. It's only available for those women or men who are like working and their area has like a kindergarten, or those who can afford it. But from fifth, the age of 5 until 18, it's the age group from first grade until like 12th grade. But until like when you hit 18, mostly all girls and boys are graduating from 12th grade.
How old would you be at 6th grade?
Yeah, that's what.
So 11, 12.
Okay. So typical secondary age for us as well, or thereabouts. That move. Yeah, great. Does anyone have any additional questions?
It very much.
I'll recap the question from the recording. So the question was, how are parents involved in supporting children's homework in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so it very much depends on the family dynamic and how available the parents are, or how educated they are. Sometimes they come from families who are not educated at all, so they can't really help the children with the homework. But I feel like one of the very successful students in many classes are basically the students that come from those poor and uneducated backgrounds, because they study harder than those who just their parents just pay for them to go to school. But to your question, it depends on the family, their basically level of income and how educated they are. I know that in Kabul, the capital city, this is more common, where the parents study with the children basically. But outside Afghanistan, where we don't even have like proper facilities or like buildings for students, so it's just like they're on their own, and sometimes they don't even have proper books or teachers. So but in Kabul city, capital city, it used to be like the parents would have meetings with the principal, and they would have meeting with the teachers, and if they had any issues. But that's also more like into the higher level of school, or if it's like private school, they would have more time for those kind of stuff. But it's mostly just it's on like they're on their own, and also it depends on the family.
Thank you, that's great. Any more questions before we move on? Okay, well, thanks, Shahrazad. That was really helpful, I think, to give us that context to start off with. And I know you're going to be listening in for the rest of the call. So if there's anything Afghan specific that people want to ask in relation to anything we say, then please do, because Shahrazad will be really happy, I know, to come back and answer more questions as we go. So could we move on to the next slide, please, Alex? A lot of the work that we're doing on our project has a foundation of coaching, and really helping people to start to learn to get some of those critical thinking skills, which Shahrazad mentioned, around being able to ask questions, plan for themselves, and take some ownership really of their own development and their plans for the future. It's really helpful when you do coaching skills training. This is one of the things I found most helpful, is to understand the continuum between being a mentor and being a coach. So I'm going to just quickly outline that before we go on to talk about the next piece of the role of the workshop leader. As a mentor, you're somebody who has experience and knows their stuff in a particular area, and you're going to share that on with somebody who doesn't know as much as you, because they're new into the space or it's something new for them. A coach doesn't need to know anything at all technically about something in order to support someone to get better at it, because their skill is around asking good questions, listening well, building that support relationship, being able to summarize back to someone what they've heard, dive a little bit deeper and help someone plan. And technically speaking, I could, as a coach, for example, go to somebody who's playing tennis and help coach them on getting their game going without knowing anything about tennis, just through having those skills of questioning and reflecting back and helping with planning. So this is a continuum. And the point here is that often we will find ourselves at the mentoring end, because by definition, we know a lot more, having lived in this country, in most of our cases for most or all of our lives, but certainly for longer than the people we're supporting in the workshops. So we know a lot more about life in the UK. We're experts by experience. So people look to us to be a mentor and to share on that expertise. And it's very appropriate for us to do that. We can bring things to life by giving examples of things we've seen or heard to make it a bit more real. However, the advantage of the coaching stance is that it's getting people waking up to thinking for themselves And if you think about something for yourself, you're much more likely to act on it, to actually own your action and to do something with the information. So there's a bit of a skill when you're doing these workshops in knowing how to move fluidly between these two spaces and be the person who shares your experience, but also leaves space and time for people to think for themselves, to be asked a question and reflect, so that it goes in a bit deeper, they're applying what you're telling them, and they're thinking about how they're going to make that something they do something with when they walk out of the room. So that's the first kind of piece of information I'd like to share with you. When we run workshops, and many of us, I suspect, or people on this call probably have a lot of experience in this area, but I'm going to just go with the basics because not everyone may. Fundamentally, there's three different takes. So you can go in as a presenter, you've got the information, and you're going to share that information with people who are there because they want to hear it and learn about it. And that's pretty much what we're doing today. You know, we're presenting information, explaining it on, a bit of a chance to ask some questions, but that's how we're running this workshop. However, at points, we're going to go into being more facilitative. So stick you in a breakout room and ask you to think of some questions, for example, would be a good example of how you're going to facilitate people to think, or coach people to think a little bit for themselves. And that was a very light touch example. And then finally, we've got the stance of a trainer. A trainer is responsible not just for sharing information, but for also really making sure that people have understood it and are going to be able to appropriately apply it. So it's a bit of a depth down of experience, whereas a presenter won't know how people are responding to what they're sharing and what they're going to do with it. That's not their responsibility. Their responsibility is to communicate clearly and to make the information available. Within these three different stances, if you like, we've got three in the middle, which everybody, all of these three roles will encompass. So as I've already mentioned, by definition, if you're running a workshop in the Welcome Workshop scheme, you're going to be an expert by experience because you're going to know more than the people you're supporting about life in the UK. You're also going to be in a group organizer role because you're going to be part of helping people get into the space, work out where to sit, do the housekeeping, make sure people are hydrated, all of those things that groups need taking care of in order to be able to sit down and learn together. And I've left till last, but probably I should do it first because it's one of the most important, I think, is the role of the welcomer. We covered this a bit in our last session, but making sure that people feel that they're very much, it's a very friendly space and that they're greeted, that they're there's a warmth to the experience, there's some hospitality involved. It's really important because if I come into the room and I feel welcomed, I'm already warmed up to participating and being part of and feeling that this belongs to me. And that's particularly important, building on what we've learned from Shahrazad about the more formal, more passive approach to education that you might experience in a school in Afghanistan. So I'm not quite sure, am I expected to contribute? Am I expected to be able to ask a question? If I want to ask a question, the welcome will really give me permission to do that. So those three bits in the middle would apply whether you were operating as a presenter, a facilitator, or a trainer. There are a few sub roles associated with these roles around the edges. So as a presenter, it's very helpful to be able to just tell the odd story to bring what you're saying to life. Things can get very technical and quite dry if you just run through a lot of facts. So pausing just to give a bit of an anecdote or an example makes it much more memorable for people, what you're sharing. And often what people remember isn't what you tell them, but how you make them feel. Storytelling hardwires us to a different bit of our brain, the bit of our brain that responds more unconsciously. And so I'm not talking about great big elaborate stories or sort of dramatic presentations, but just little examples to pop in to bring things to life a little bit. Can be really helpful. In terms of a trainer, we're coming on later on in this session to how you check for understanding. But if you decide that you want to run this workshop as more of a training model than a presenting model, you do need to consider how you're going to check that people have understood and what they might do with the information you're giving them. You won't have much opportunity to do much of that because the content is quite packed. And so most of it, I suspect, will be in presenter mode. Finally, if you are in a facilitator, taking a facilitation approach, then the role of somebody who's a responsive supporter is much more available to you. So you're more able to make that emotional connection with people, to personalize the content and to listen to what their issues are and adapt. However, one of the reasons we've put this slide in is that having had conversations with the people who've designed the Welcome workshop experience, it's fairly clear that it's not going to be very practical or easy to do the facilitation piece, because there is a lot of very important information to communicate. And by default, really, you're going to find yourself more in the role of the presenter, and with a little bit of the trainer who sort of checks that people have understood. But it's a choice. And you might decide you want to take one workshop and slow it down a bit and have a bit more room for people to think it through for themselves. So we wanted to flag that up for you. But there's of course always that option. We suspect that most people will be in presenter trainer mode. Does anyone have questions about that? Because that's a fair bit on there. I'm very happy to stop and take questions if anybody has anything they want to ask. Sometimes say, what's the question you would ask? If you had to have a question. So I can get those out. Okay, so we'll move on. So we mentioned that we have a framework which we use because a lot of the work we're doing is around well-being and sustaining people's well-being and ensuring their well-being, and having a psychologically informed environment when you're running workshops is really helpful. So this model, I think, Alex, you're going to speak a bit to the model. Is that right? I'm going to hand over to you.
So yeah, basically, so this model is based on a model of psychological well-being by Riff and Singer. And so we chose this for this project because it's a really good kind of comprehensive, multi-dimensional model for describing different aspects of psychological well-being. And we felt that well-being was a very important consideration for this project in particular. And yeah, this model has been really useful in studies of refugee psychological experiences in general, and war-related trauma, and also post-traumatic growth. So it seemed like a very appropriate thing to use. So as you can see, it kind of it divides psychological well-being into 6 main dimensions: positive relations with others, environmental mastery, self-acceptance, autonomy, personal growth, and purpose in life. And so I'm now going to hand you back to Jose to just explain how these dimensions relate to the key elements of the Bright Path Futures project.
And I want to really bring this back particularly to the theme of what we're here to talk about today, which is your workshops and how you're going to land them and how you're going to make sure that people walk out having learned as much as possible. So I mentioned welcome. I think that bit about what people first experience when they come into the room is very important, because if you have that sense of community and being part of a group and you feel like you're enjoying yourself, and sometimes it can be even a bit playful, you will learn better. The more passive people are, the less they learn, generally speaking, and the more active they are and the more they process and think about how to apply something, the more they learn. You won't have time to do a lot of activities or a lot of processing, but that first bit about getting people feeling comfortable in the room will go a long, long way towards that. And the environmental mastery piece is also really important here, because if I'm on a cultural sticking point and you've said something and I can't get past it, that's what I'll be thinking about. You know, I'm going to stop listening to the rest of it. So being really mindful of, are you coming up to something which might be a bit of a boom point for people? And if you are, do you want to maybe tackle that towards the end, or do you want to kind of you find a way of referencing and bracketing something which people might get quite preoccupied by, and say, you know, this is really important, we'd love to talk about it more, but actually, you know, today we've still got all these other great things to share with you. So something about managing expectations around those cultural sticking points. The autonomy piece is particularly important in terms of the gender issues, because generally speaking, and this is a huge generalization, it won't apply to everybody, but women will tend to assume that men will talk more if they're in a shared space. And this is what I've been told by my Afghan colleagues. It's also mirrored by my experience when I've been spending time running sessions for people. So thinking about how to manage the activities in the space so that everybody does get their voice shared is something which is quite useful. And for example, just asking directly, does anyone from this table have anything they want to share back, and signaling really and giving permission that everybody's voice is equally valid in the room. Also valuing people's expertise and their experience. If somebody has an example to share, like, yes, build on it, because the more people can kind of see themselves as having their own expertise, the more they're going to learn. People teaching each other, I found this tremendously helpful, but I don't think you're going to find that there's a lot of time in your sessions to do that. But during the break times and the lunch times, that's where these kind of conversations about what people have been hearing can be really useful. And if you do hear somebody kind of speaking to somebody else about something, you can always come back to it in a session and go, oh, I overheard that, would you mind sharing on? A lot of the work that we're doing in the Welcome Week is around aspiration and around setting people on a path where they really can kind of take ownership of their lives and get started in the UK. So the more we can reference that and reference where we are of the great potential of people in the room, make a really positive picture about what they can do with their lives now they're here. Because it's very easy, and you'll see at the bottom of our model, there's some green grass with the path. It talks about being solutions focused. When there are so many challenges and so much stress for people and are so worried about their families, it's very easy to just keep thinking about the things that are going wrong. And what we're trying to do here is to flag up all the wonderful things that can go right as well, and all the great things, the choices and opportunities people will have going forwards, building on resource, looking at what people can already do, what they're already good at, and how to kind of do more with that. So whatever opportunity you have while you're sharing information to kind of get that sense of, yes, you can, the better. That will really help people to leave the room feeling like, I've got a life ahead of me and I'm interested in what that might look like. And finally, in terms of self-acceptance, I had this experience today. I was teaching a group of Afghan women, and somebody with a trauma background became very distressed in the space, a conversation that happened. So just we covered this off in the last session, but I'm going to mention it again here. Be prepared. Some of the conversations you're having may be a bit triggering for people, and if feelings come out, it can be quite challenging for that person, and also quite disruptive to people in the room who may get quite impatient because they're here to learn. So having a bit of a plan about what will happen if somebody needs some care and attention, who might do that, how you can gently kind of take them out to the room and give them some space and support, and allow the workshop to sort of continue. It may not happen, but if it does happen, it's really good to sort of think in advance what you might do in that situation. I think that's probably enough about our model for now. Again, very happy to take any questions about that. I don't know if anyone has anything they want to ask. You can always put questions in the chat as well if you want to. Okay, so we're going to move on to thinking about how you lay the room out. And I'm handing over to Alex.
Okay, yeah. So this relates quite closely to what Jose was saying a little bit earlier about the roles of the person who's leading the session. So one thing that might influence or be influenced by what role you take within a session is how you choose to lay out the room or the space that you're in. So, for example, you might choose to go for a kind of a circular formation, or you might have everyone facing the front. You might go for a horseshoe, or you might have people sitting in small groups around tables, for example. So we're going to just explore what the implications might be of using these different types of layouts for your session. Okay, so you've got kind of representations of these layouts just here in this picture, and what we're going to do at this point is we're going to ask you to go back into breakout rooms in a minute and to kind of to give some thought to these questions. So looking at these different layouts, so which layout will give most talk time to most people? Which one will make it easier for quiet people to speak and harder for dominant voices to take over? So that's a really important thing to consider in terms of kind of giving equal an equal opportunity for everyone really to be able to speak, despite how dominant or how reticent they might be. Which one helps you hold the audience's attention better when you're presenting, and which one allows you to check in with people when they're doing tasks or activities? So that might include being able to to physically move around a room more easily. Which one allows people to make most connections in the room, and which one do you prefer and why? So we're going to ask you to go into breakout rooms. So I think, Jose, I think you're setting those up. Are you going to do pairs again, Jose, or perhaps threes? I think you're muted. I think you're still muted.
I think she's got a connection problem.
No, I'm back. I was actually just trying to share that slide in with you in the breakout room so you could see it and post it in. Alex, are you able to stick it in the chat? Is that possible?
Yeah, I can try to put it in the chat.
Just to make this a bit quicker, do you mind just taking a quick screenshot, everybody, of the slide? We're actually, to be honest with you, still working out Eventbrite and Zoom, and we've got a slightly different version of Zoom here. It's the one I'm used to working with. So to save some time, if you just do a quick screenshot of this so that you can see it once you're in the breakout room, that would be really helpful.
Yeah.
Is that okay for everybody?
I'll see if it's possible for me to take a snip of it as well and put it in the chat.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Belt and braces.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so while you're doing that, I'm just going to set up the breakout rooms. I'll pop you in there and we'll put people in different rooms this time. Right, I'm just opening the rooms now. Do give us a shout if you're stuck. We have about 5 minutes for this. But if you wave, we can come in. Flora and Nadine, have you got an invite to go into a room? There we are. Flora, I don't know if you can hear or if you...
Sorry, yeah, I don't have an invitation.
Oh, don't you? That's strange. You should do. That's weird. Let's have a look. I'm going to put you in a different room.
I think I'm having problem with the connection. Maybe you send them.
Oh, yeah. And I think this is the point, is that there is no one good solution because there are pros and cons to each of these models. And a lot of it, as people have said, feeding back is about reading the room and understanding the group you're with. If you've got a large group or a smaller group, will make a difference. If people are very confident and vociferous, or if they're very shy, you're going to adapt accordingly. And it might be that you start off with layout number 2. And if you're lucky enough to have that more modern kind of workshop furniture where it's on wheels and it's flexy, you know, there's nothing to stop you sometimes sort of going, okay, after the break, when you come back, you know, you'll be sitting around smaller tables. If you've got heavy old-fashioned furniture, that's much harder to do. So a lot of this will be driven by practicalities, but being aware that the layout makes a massive difference to the response you get from the people, and you have the power, how your stance when people come into the room, how you welcome them, how you stand, how you hold yourself, how you set out the room. All of these things are a kind of an unconscious invitation to people to behave in a certain way, and the more conscious you are of that, the more control you have really on gosh, this is just getting very noisy and chaotic. I'd really like to calm this down a bit. So, you know, we're going to set the room out now in this shape, and that's going to get everybody a little bit more focused. Or they're deadly quiet and they must be thinking of loads of things that I can't get out of them. I want this to get a bit more of a buzz. You know, next session after lunch, let's sort of move things around a bit. And knowing you have those choices is quite helpful. So thank you. Alex, if you want to move us on. So we've talked a bit about hospitality. I can't imagine why I bang on about that so much. But the think, pair, share model, if you've got kids at school, you'll have heard about this. You know, this is a very classic thing of, we did it a bit earlier, actually. The first thing we did here in this session was, instead of giving the group as a whole a kind of, do you want to ask her as a question? I put good money on if I'd done that, we wouldn't have had any questions to ask her, because people don't tend to ask questions in a whole group environment. There's all sorts of reasons behind that, but it's just a kind of a given, really. So if you want to get questions, and don't forget, questions do flush out where people haven't understood something, where you have assumptions that aren't right, where there's misinformation, and deeper learning. So questions are really important at points for difficult issues. Then the easy way to do it is to say, okay, turn to the person sitting next to you, think of a question together, and then we'll come back. And again, there are sort of choices at that point about how you get the questions out into the space. So you can say, right, has anyone got ready to share? That's quite hard for people, actually, to be the first. And again, you'll get that dominant voice thing happening, and straight away everyone else goes, oh, well, that's their job, I don't need to do that in this space. If you can nominate or inquire and say, oh, I'd like to hear from you, that can be a little bit full on for people to be sort of put in the spotlight. So doing that with someone who appears more confident and more comfortable with that is generally a good idea. And one of my things I do regularly, and not everybody would like this, but it works for me, is once I've got one person started with doing this is my question, I would say, who do you want to hear from next? So they can then turn to somebody they probably know, so it makes it a bit easier, and they go, oh, what about so and so? And so the group become a bit self-selecting, but people are invited to kind of step forward, and if they're not as confident about doing that, it gives them that permission. You won't have time necessarily to get all the questions out if you do this model and you have a big group. So managing that expectation in advance and saying to people, right, we want everyone to have a question. We probably only have time to hear 5, but you know, if then anyone's got a really important one, we'll take it. Means that people aren't then sort of disappointed when there isn't time for their question. So there's quite a bit about sort of simple strategies to make that feel smooth and easy, and that you've got a chance to kind of hear what it is that people are needing to know. Moving on from the think, pair, share and how you deal with group Q&A, the last word sharing is another really simple technique which will work in any workshop environment. So you've finished, you've done the content, you're going to hold 5 minutes back at the end. What's one thing you want to remember, or one word, one sentence, because you don't want people rattling on for a long time. You won't have time, but a real kind of, you can use gesture just to kind of indicate, keep it short, but what's one thing? And as you hear the one things, if somebody can help to write those things up on the flip chart, what you're getting then is a kind of aggregate of the key points from the session which matter, and the group have made that. So straight away, if you've got no other way of getting the group to have ownership of the content, that's done it, because they've taken it, they've remembered it, and they've mirrored it back. It's theirs. And that's really important in terms of acting on that information and doing something with it when they leave the room, which is what we want. Otherwise, everyone's wasted their time. They've sat there and nodded and thought it sounded good and then forgotten everything when they leave. And that's another reason to do this last word sharing, is that you need to reinforce the key points. If you've got a lot of information, it's useful for you to know what are the 3 big things that you want people to still remember in 6 weeks' time. You know, if everything else gets forgotten, what really matters here? You reinforce that, but they're doing their own selection, and they're then kind of pulling out the things that they want to remember. And that list can be held, it can be photographed, it can be circulated. So it's a real kind of anchor for the learning that's happened. It's also about creating consensus in the room of we feel this together as a group. That reinforces a sense of belonging. Belonging helps with identity. Identity creates safety. Safety reinforces learning, cultural integration. You know, a lot of things are happening in a group dynamic, which can take you in the direction of disempowering someone and shutting them down, or empowering them and opening them up, which are very, very simple. You know, this is ever so simple, but it can have a bit of an impact, which is why we're choosing to share it with you here. So, yeah, time check. Yep. In the spirit of Think, Pair, Share, let's send you back for a 1 minute. We've given you quite a bit of information here, and I really like you to digest that. Think about the one thing you'd like to remember or any questions you have, and come back into the space. So we'll send you in back to the people that you were with before. That's simplest. So off you go. That's okay. So I'll come in there. That's a very good point. And the point that's just been raised from the breakout rooms is the question of how you can work with people who are not working their first language. Never mind the information's all new, you know, you've got the language barrier as well. And I'm really glad you raised that point, because it's actually something we probably should have covered in this training. And I'm realizing that as I listen, which is about how you work with interpreters. So I've been very blessed actually that my colleagues and co-workers on the project, obviously native speakers, so we have a lot more flexibility really from a language point of view, but we're often doing double interpreting. So for example, the session I was running today, somebody gets it from English to Dari, but there's somebody in the room who only speaks Pashto, so then it needs to go from Dari to Pashto. If you have an interpreter who speaks both languages, then that's great, but then you have to think about the time it takes to make sure that it's been explained on fully to both language groups. So that's something in terms of group management and managing the workshop you need to consider quite carefully, and know who speaks which language and who only speaks one language, because most Pashto speakers can also understand Dari in the whole, but not everybody. And if you've got one or two people who only speak Pashto, it's a really different question. Do you have somebody buddying them next to them whose job it is to kind of, is a participant perhaps, whose job it is to pass information on, and you need to just check, is this going too fast? The other thing is about what an interpreter does. Now, classically, an interpreter's job is to take what you say and put it into a different language, and that's it. But when we're working on the project, we're recognizing that there's two levels of interpretation. There's linguistic interpretation and there's cultural interpretation, and they're both really important. So if I'm trying to explain a concept which just doesn't have any point of reference for somebody who's grown up in Afghanistan, and Munir's working with me, he won't just translate what I say, he'll contextualize it, he'll refer to it, he might use a Quran quote to kind of anchor it in something people already know. And we have a really sort of, it's important, our working relationship, that I trust that he's very skilled at being able to help people come on that journey from thinking Afghani to thinking UK, and that he can do that work, but also that he knows that I really want him to do that, and I trust him to do that. So thinking about, if you're the person who's presenting in English, what you want your interpreter to do, taking time to talk to them about that in advance, check in and say, shall we try it this way at the break? Let's see how that was going. Well, you know, how much of it were you having to kind of filter or explain on a little bit more to make sure people understood? The other thing is that there are two levels of language in Dari, and it's much more delineated than it is in English. So you have formal and informal Dari, and they're different words, not a different accent or a different way of speaking. There's quite a kind of a sense of, if you are very well educated, that you'll kind of assume that in a context like a workshop like this, that we should be using the formal language. And that ties back to what Sherazad was saying at the beginning of, this is how education is done, you know, it's kind of presented in this way, and we have to kind of go and meet the teacher rather than the teacher coming to meet us. However, the majority of people in the space probably don't use that language and may not understand all of those words. So you've got a double kind of translation effort if they're using kind of high Dari. I don't think that's the technical term, but in my head, that's how I think about it. And talking to your interpreter and sort of checking that, can you use the informal version of Dari? Can you make sure you're using language which everybody can understand? And thinking about the Pashto speakers and how that works as well is a really key part of preparing to go into the space. So Flora, thank you. That was a really helpful question. And I hope my explanation on has helped give you a bit more to think about with that.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So I'm just going to pause it. Okay, that's a pleasure. So we're talking about networking and support, peer support. This is something in our project we take quite seriously, because we think that you or anyone holding a space for Afghan families is doing quite a big thing. You know, this isn't a small thing really, to be able to help people with big questions, big issues, big feelings. You know, people are really worried about their families back home. They don't know necessarily where they're going to move to. They may only have a day's notice to move there. You know, there's a lot out of people's control. And so you have to have the skills to be able to hold that kind of emotional intelligence in the space. And in your turn, for the system to be healthy and well supported psychologically, it's good for you to have support too. So one of the things that we're mooting is an idea of Nadine and one of the Bright Path Futures team holding a weekly space for people who are running these workshops to just come in together and chat and debrief and find out what's been going well, any sticking points, how other people have tackled something. So you're not by yourselves, because it's happening all over the country. And we wanted to make sure that people have that kind of support in place for themselves, so that it's the aeroplane mask thing again, isn't it? You know, look after yourself first and you're in a much better position to take care of other people. So networking, really important. And the question about preparing for if somebody gets into a distress point, I think that word preparation is probably one which we're kind of coming back to through this session again and again. And the more you have thought in advance about what if and how could we and what might the impact be, then the more kind of steady, ready, grounded, available you can be when you're in the session, because you're not having to problem solve everything on the spot and then half your brain somewhere else. So it's that warm up for yourself of what are you bringing into the room when you walk in, of like, yeah, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen here, but I've had a bit of a think, I feel reasonably prepared. And that's a good thing to take away. Okay, shall we move on? I'm going to turn a light on here. There we go.
Actually, could I just jump in for a second? I think it was Mandy who raised the point about dealing with, you know, distress and that sort of thing. So last week's session, I think Jose may have mentioned this a little earlier in this session, but last week's session did focus on that sort of thing, on trauma, but also on, you know, what you might do to prevent people from being triggered in the first place. I mean, there are certain things we can do to try and you know, help people feel supported and welcome, and to kind of develop trust within a group, but also how to deal with if somebody does become distressed or have a flashback or that sort of thing. But we're hoping to send out the link to that recording, and it's going to be on YouTube. So we're hoping to send that out with the link to this recording. So hopefully that will be helpful.
Thank you. Alex, can I just say one more thing while we're on that topic? Is that okay? So I'm really conscious that you're going to be in situations where people know each other, and if particularly people are living in hotels together, there can be all sorts of dynamics going on. You might have big feuds, you might have dramas, you might have people who kind of really rely on each other or are in active conflict with each other, and you won't necessarily know. So if it does go boom, and sometimes things do go boom in quite dramatic ways, then the key word is de-escalation. I mean, if anyone's done any managing challenging behavior type training before, or have been in those situations, you'll know that what we're always trying to do is take the oxygen away from the fire, bring things down a notch, down another notch. I had a situation very recently where somebody I was working with had extreme trauma and got very, very triggered and just started shouting, and it took 15 minutes to kind of calm that down. And of course, everybody else then is drawn into that. You know, they're clustering around, they're trying to support, they're trying to be kind. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So if you do get into a situation where it goes a bit, sort of, there's a conflagration of feeling and all that's pouring out, then thinking of ways to just kind of put that pause button in. And sometimes it's about very directly taking ownership of the space and going, okay, everyone, stop, please sit down. Because that making things safe sometimes takes a very strong, confident voice to be in charge. And then that, someone's in charge now. Okay. And then just very gently, the person who's in distress, supporting them to either just give them something to do. You know, can you help me sort these cards out? Could you help me to sort of pour these waters? So taking them away from the feeling state and into something very practical, or just taking them out of the space, you'll find for yourself what it is to sort of help that person come down. But de-escalate if you do find yourself in that situation is kind of really key.
Thanks, Jess. Yeah, so just really to round off, so we're going to think a little bit about checking understanding. So this came up a few minutes ago. Really, we already talked about kind of language barrier, and this really relates to that. So I would say the main things are in terms of checking understanding is to try to kind of make sure that we put information across as clearly as possible in the first place. So clear instructions, clear content. As Jo said, perhaps trying to prioritize certain points and perhaps repeating those points as well is useful. Visual aids is always helpful, especially in a second language environment, to reinforce the content, what we're saying. And translation and interpretation also, as Jo's mentioned, might be necessary. But when it comes to kind of trying to work out whether people have actually understood the points that we're trying to get across, I think from a teacher's perspective, I can say, don't assume understanding. Quite often, if you were to just say, okay, is everyone okay with that? Or has everyone understood that? Quite often people will nod along, will say yes, perhaps because they feel a bit self-conscious about admitting that they might not understand something, perhaps to be polite, but actually we can't assume that they have actually understood. So as a teacher, there are different ways that we might check understanding. So we might ask people to paraphrase what we've just said, so that they're not just echoing the words that we've said, but they're actually putting it in different words, which is a different level. It shows that they need to understand it in order to do that. Another thing that you can do is to ask concept checking questions. So these are basically simple and clear questions, closed questions, which have very specific answers. So it could be a yes/no question, or it could be a question where there's only one possible correct answer. And so that is a good way to really check whether someone's understood something. So, for example, we might, if we've given perhaps some information about, okay, so tomorrow you need to be at the doctor's at this time and you need to bring so and so. An example of a closed question would be, okay, so where are you going tomorrow? What time do you need to be there? What do you need to bring? So that's an example of the types of questions that we might ask. I think that was everything really to say about checking understanding. But does anybody have any questions about any of that, or perhaps any comments, any other strategies that you might use to check understanding?
They'll have to be fairly swift because we have 3 minutes to close. So yeah, quick ones if there are. Okay, so let's model rather than just tell you about it. Let's do it. If we could hear from each of you one thing you'd like to remember in 6 weeks' time from what we've done today, and let's see what we come up with collectively. Mandy, could we start with you? What's your one thing?
So I think mine would be the have a plan in advance for how I'm going to deal with any sort of distressed individuals or conflict in a session. Okay,
who do you want to hear from next?
Who's still on the call? Shauna?
Have you got your one thing, Shauna?
My one thing would be planning around interpreters, and how I would use a room if I was delivering like a presentation.
Great. Who do you want to hear from?
I want to hear from Flora.
I think the same, planning. I think looking at what are the topics, because we have different kind of topics. Which is the topic that I need? It's the first actually I need to start, and thinking about how I need to run the session, engaging with the families, and setting around and any kind of unexpected kind of attention that might come on the session. So going through all those questions and making sure that I prepare. I have, yes, something on my mind before.
Lise, have you got something for us?
Well, just for me, it's more about, my concern is there's quite a lot to get packed in quite a tight timescale. So I'm quite aware of, being able to deliver, if I am delivering the session in a compact yet friendly manner, but taking into account all the complexities that this cohort may bring into a session. So yeah, I'm still thinking.
Yeah. And I think the practical thing there is you've always got the bold, you can put things in bold. So you've got all the content, but if you go through and you kind of highlight or put in a different color, the big takeaways, it's a mental note to self, isn't it? Just to really hammer that bit home or spend a bit more time on it. And then if you do run out of time, at least you know that you've got through the bits that you really, really want people to hear.
Yeah.
These resources have been shared with very much a spirit of trust that the people delivering them will know what the group needs, know what they've already had, and they're designed to be used flexibly, really. It's very much down to you to use them in a way which feels productive for you. Okay, so thanks very much. I'm really appreciative of everybody's time coming on the call. I'm just going to